Call ended before I did. She said what she said, and I stood in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire off the highway, keys in my hand, watching a crow pick at something on the asphalt. I don't know why I remember the crow. I remember it clearly. My daughter-in-law had just told me to be out of the house by Friday. It was Tuesday. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a pipefitter in Fort McMurray, came home when the work dried up, moved into my son's place in Barrie when my knees got bad enough that stairs were a conversation I had to have with myself every morning. That was 3 years ago. My son, my only son, had invited me. He'd said, "Dad, we have the room." He'd said it makes more sense than you rattling around in that apartment in Sudbury. He'd said a lot of things. His wife had said them too, at the time. I paid rent. Not a lot, but I paid. $700 a month, which in Barrie isn't nothing and isn't enough, but it was the number we agreed on. I bought groceries on Sundays, kept to myself mostly, watched the hockey games in my room so I wasn't in their living room every night. I tried to take up as little space as possible, the way you do when you're living in someone else's house, even if that someone is your own blood. Then my wife's mother passed in February. My wife and I had separated 11 years ago, quietly, without lawyers, the way people do when they've run out of energy to fight, and neither one of them is a bad person. Just two people who turned into strangers somewhere between the kids leaving home and the mortgage being paid off. We stayed cordial. We came to the grandchildren's birthdays. We sat at opposite ends of the table at Christmas, and nobody had to explain anything because there was nothing dramatic to explain. Her mother left her the house in Orangeville, a modest place on a corner lot that had been in the family since 1974, and enough in a savings account that my son, when he found out, got a look on his face I hadn't seen since he was 9, and found out Santa Claus wasn't real. That particular look, recalibrating. I didn't think much of it. My wife's inheritance was her business. We weren't together. I had no claim to anything, and I wasn't looking for one. But my daughter-in-law had done math. I found this out on a Tuesday afternoon in a Canadian Tire parking lot. She called me directly, not through my son. That should have told me something. She was pleasant about it, the way people are pleasant when they've already made up their minds, and the pleasantness is just courtesy, a thin coat of paint over a decision that dried hours ago. She said they were thinking of converting my room into a home office. She said with everything changing, they wanted to reassess the arrangement. She said Friday would give me time to find something. I asked where my son was. She said he was at work. I said I'd talk to him when he got home. She said that was fine. I drove home. I put the bag of weather stripping I'd bought into the garage. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 3 years, and I looked at the wall and I thought about what Friday meant as a deadline for a 63-year-old man with bad knees and a fixed income in a rental market that had lost its mind sometime around 2021 and never found it again. My son came home at 6:15. He set his jacket on the hook by the door the way he always does, a habit so old I remembered teaching it to him, and he came into the kitchen and I could tell by the way he moved that he already knew about the call. He poured himself a glass of water. He stood at the counter. He didn't sit down. I asked him how long they'd been planning this. He said it wasn't planned, it was just that things were shifting. I asked him what things. He said his wife felt the house needed to be their space again. He said it with the careful flatness of someone repeating a sentence they'd rehearsed or had rehearsed for them. I said I understood that. I said I needed more than 4 days. He said he figured 2 weeks was probably fair. 2 weeks. I turned that over. 31 years of pipe fitting, of being gone 6 months at a time in northern Alberta so that boy could have hockey gear and school trips to Ottawa and a college education he didn't finish but could have, and 2 weeks was what was fair. I didn't say any of that. I said, okay, 2 weeks. He nodded and went upstairs. I called my wife that night. Not for help, just I don't know. She'd known me for 40 years. Sometimes you just call the person who's known you the longest. She was quiet for a moment when I told her. Then she said, "That's not right, Walter." I told her my name. She called me by the wrong name, which she sometimes did now, a small confusion that came and went. I'd learned not to make a thing of it. She said, "Come stay in Orangeville while you sort yourself out." I said I didn't want to put her out. She said, "The house has 3 bedrooms and I'm rattling around in it alone. Come stay in the back room while you find a place." I said I'd think about it. 2 days later, my son's wife called again. My son was at work again. She said she'd found some nice bachelor apartments online and texted me 3 links. All of them were over $1,400 a month. One of them described a galley kitchen as a feature. I opened the links. I closed them. I called a number I hadn't called in a long time. His name was Everett, a man I'd worked with in Fort Mac who'd become a paralegal after he blew out his shoulder and couldn't go back to the trades. We kept in loose touch over the years, the way tradesmen do, a text at Christmas, a phone call when someone from the old crew passed away. I didn't call him for legal advice exactly. I called him because he was a kind of person who knew things, and I needed to know things. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. Then he was quiet for a moment and said, "Did you have anything in writing about the rental arrangement?" I said we'd done a simple month-to-month agreement, just a piece of paper we both signed when I moved in, nothing formal. He said that was actually something. He said in Ontario, even a family member in an informal rental arrangement has tenant rights. Month to month means 60 days notice, minimum, not 2 weeks. He said I should look up the Residential Tenancies Act and not move until I was ready to move. I sat with that for a while. I didn't want to be the father who lawyers up against his own son. That wasn't who I was. But I also didn't want to be the man who ends up in a bachelor apartment the size of a storage unit because he was too polite to know his rights. So I wrote my son a letter, not an email, a letter by hand, which I left on the kitchen table one morning before anyone else was up. I told him I loved him. I told him I didn't want conflict. I told him I'd been doing some reading and I believed I was entitled to 60 days notice under the Residential Tenancies Act, and I wanted to sort this out between us without involving anyone else. I also mentioned that I'd be speaking to a lawyer just to understand my position, not threatening, informing. I left from my walk, and when I came back an hour later, the letter was gone from the table. Nobody said anything at dinner. 3 days later, my son asked if I could sit down with him and his wife after the kids went to bed. I said, of course. We sat in the living room. His wife had her laptop open on the coffee table, which I noticed. She started talking about the house, about their plans, about the conversion. She was civil, more civil than the parking lot phone call, more careful with her words. She mentioned that they'd love to support me in finding a place. She mentioned the rental links again. I said I appreciated that. I said I'd be happy to move as soon as I found something I could afford on a pension and CPP, which was a process that was going to take longer than 2 weeks. She said she understood that. I said I also wanted to be transparent that based on my understanding of the Residential Tenancies Act, the legal notice period for a month-to-month arrangement was 60 days. She looked at her laptop. She looked at my son. Something moved between them that I wasn't supposed to see and probably shouldn't describe. My son said he'd look into it. I said there was no rush. I was comfortable. I was happy to keep paying rent while I searched. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at my hands the way you do when you're 63 and you've worked with them your whole life and you still can't believe what they've been through and what they've carried. The next week my son called me into the kitchen alone. His wife was at her spin class. He sat down across from me, no laptop, no prepared speech. He looked like a man who'd had a few conversations with himself in the mirror recently and hadn't entirely liked what he saw. He said he'd looked into it. He said I was right about the 60 days. I said I knew. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know this wasn't my idea originally." I let that sit there. I didn't pick it up and turn it over. I just let it sit. He said his wife had been stressed since the thing with her mother's money, and he said some things had been said, and he said he knew it didn't make it right. I said I appreciated him telling me. He asked if I was angry. I thought about it honestly, the way you can when you're 63 and you've been angry enough times to know what it costs. I said I was hurt more than angry. I said there was a difference. He nodded like he understood that. Maybe he did. He was my son. I'd raised him. I moved to Orangeville at the end of April. Not because I had to, not because I'd run out of options or lost something. I moved because my wife, my ex-wife, had offered a room and I'd taken it, and because it turned out that being in a house with someone who'd known you for 40 years was easier than being in a house where you had to earn your place every morning. We were not together. That needs saying. We had coffee in the mornings and watched the news and went our own ways, and that was enough, which at 63 is a kind of abundance I hadn't expected. I found an apartment in Orangeville in June. Main floor, 2 bedrooms, a small yard that the landlord said I could use. A retired couple owned the building. The woman who showed me the place asked what I did, and I said I was retired trades, and she said her husband would want to talk to me about the deck he'd been meaning to fix for 2 summers. I said that sounded fine. I paid first and last and signed a proper lease this time, 12 months, everything in writing. My son called me the week I moved in. He said he hoped the place was good. I said it was. He said the kids had been asking about me, and I said I'd come up for a weekend soon. I did. I went up in July. I had dinner with all of them, the kids climbing on me the way they do, and I sat at the table and I ate the meal his wife had made, which was good, and nobody pretended anything had happened or hadn't happened. We just all sat there like a family that had been through something and was still a family, which is the most honest thing I know how to say about it. My daughter-in-law asked how the apartment was. I said it was good. I said it had a yard. She said that sounded nice. It was. It was nice. My son walked me to my truck when I was leaving. It was a warm evening, late July, the kind of evening in Ontario when the light goes gold and soft and everything looks a little like a painting of itself. He stood by the door and he said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." He said I should have said something sooner. I said, "We're saying something now. That's enough." I drove back to Orangeville with the windows down. The highway was quiet. I thought about the crow in the parking lot still. I think about it sometimes. I don't know why it stayed with me. A crow picking at asphalt, ordinary and unbothered, just doing what it needed to do in the middle of everything else happening around it. Maybe that was the part I needed to remember. I still think about the crow sometimes. It wasn't doing anything remarkable, just going about its business on a cold parking lot while everything around it was noise and motion. I think I envied it a little, standing there with my keys in my hand and my daughter-in-law's voice still in my ear. There's something to be said for a creature that doesn't explain itself, that just does what it needs to do and moves on. I'm not sure I was always that kind of person. For most of my working life I moved toward the noise, toward the hard jobs, the cold camps, the long stretches away from home. I thought that was strength. I still think there was something real in it, but what I've learned, later than I'd like to admit, is that the harder thing isn't endurance. It's knowing when to go, still. When Renee called me in that parking lot, my first instinct was to go back to the house and say something I couldn't take back. I didn't. I bought my weather stripping, and I drove home, and I made tea. That wasn't weakness. That was the kind of patience you only develop after you've seen what the other kind costs you. What I did instead was learn something. I picked up the phone and called Everett, and I read what I needed to read, and I wrote a letter by hand, because some things deserve the weight of a pen. That's what I'd call keeping your wits about you, not in a cold or calculating way, but in the way of a man who refuses to let his hurt make his decisions for him. Grief and anger are honest emotions, but they're terrible advisors. I've watched them bankrupt better men than me. The part that took the most out of me wasn't the conversation with Renee. It was sitting across from Mitchell at that kitchen table, watching my son look at the floor and say he knew it wasn't right, because I loved that boy, still do. And love doesn't stop hurting just because you understand why something happened. Understanding and forgiving aren't the same thing, though they live close to each other. I chose to do both. Not for him, not entirely. For myself. because I've carried grudges in my time and I know the weight of them, and at 63 you start making different choices about what you're willing to haul around. What came out of all of it was something I didn't expect to find at this point in my life: a place of my own, a yard, a landlord who wanted help with his deck, a quiet morning routine that belongs to nobody but me. I didn't get those things by demanding them. I got them by knowing what I was owed, saying so plainly, and then getting on with it. That's the whole of it, really. Know what's right. Say it clearly. Don't let pride or fear make you small in either direction. Not too loud, not too silent. And when it's over, drive home with the windows down if the weather allows. The crow didn't wait around to be thanked. Neither did I.